Okay, so welcome to Module 2 of our theory class. In our last session, we got a whole bunch covered, from pitch all the way to intervals, and then we started talking about where the notes are on the fretboard, the notes are on the keyboard. The first thing we're going to talk about in this segment is the word scale. Now, scale can get a little bit confusing to some folks, but the word scale to me is any pool of notes that might get decided to be used for a given piece of music. Okay? You'll find in theory classes they'll also use this word mode. There's a lot of things about why they separate the word mode from the word scale that I think don't matter at all. And I've played a lot of modal music. So to me, the way I interpret it, if I'm with people that are graduated from college and they insist on the right definitions, I'll speak their language if they need to. But I find that at this point, the word mode is interchangeable with the word scale with the way I want to teach this. Okay, so we're just going to use the word scale. But the scale is any combination of the 12 slices. Most commonly, 5 or 7, like we talked about. But if you pick any combination of the slices and say, these are the notes that we're going to use, that's a scale. There's a bajillion scales. Think about 12 notes, how many combinations there could be. There's tons of them. And really, they get pretty fun exploring the different sounds and the different emotions that unique scales can offer. Okay? However, I'm going to show you a few scales that are a little bit different than the ones you might normally just to put it in context. But I feel like in studying theory, I'm a big fan of let's learn the major scale. And let's learn, which I'm going to define in a second, and let's learn it so well that we understand it backwards and forwards and sideways. And then when we go to learn new scales, we can always reference the major scale. Oh, well, that's just a major scale with this little change and that little change. If you go to music school, they present to you 4 scales that you start off learning, one of which you absolutely never use, leaving out 2 that I use every day. And so this is my approach. Let's learn the major scale until we know it like the back of our hand, like the moods of our children. And then when we see a new scale coming across the board, we just compare it to what we already know of the major scale and say, oh, that's just a modified major scale, and it's modified in this way and that way. But that's my approach. So, however, before we jump into the major scale, I want to throw out a couple of very common scales to just give you a context. I mentioned at the end of our last module the chromatic scale, which means we're using all 12 notes. I'm going to go to the keyboard for a second, and I want to show you a couple of other scales. I'm going to play the chromatic scale, and pay attention because we're going to do a little ear training along the way. If I start with a C, let's go to the C down here, or this E, whatever, and if I'm going to use all these 12 notes, all 12 notes is the chromatic scale. So I'll use different combinations to create different colors and use different ones at different times. But if I use all 12, it's called the chromatic scale. Okay, now, the more simpler one, I could make a piece of music that only uses 3 notes. But there's not really a name for that. But there's a lot of wonderful, beautiful songs that I would sing to my child to sleep, where I only use 3 notes. Okay? But typically, to make a lot of music, you start with about 5. And there's one called the pentatonic scale. Okay? So the pentatonic scale has its roots in every single culture in the world. It could be identified as a very folk-friendly scale because you find hillbillies in Appalachian Mountains and Japanese old people that were samurais back in the days, and West African sub-Saharan musicians and Scandinavian guys up in the mountains that are doing all, and every single one of them is using the pentatonic scale. Okay, so the pentatonic scale has a very focused thing, and if I play it in a certain way, you might hear it as bluegrass, and I play it in another way, you might hear it as Chinese music. Okay, but the scale would be these notes. I'm sorry. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So those 5 notes. So I could go. Okay. Now I will say you should be impressed because playing upside down is really difficult, and to get anything at all. Thank you very much. To get anything at all musical, but those 5 notes given now in give one instrument those notes and these combinations can make all kinds of folk music happen until Jesus came back. Now typically though, most of the time we're going to use a 7-note scale, which is the major, but I want to show you one other one And it's called the whole tone scale. And this is just for fun to give you some context, okay? Remember when I said a half step and a whole step in other circles could be called a semitone and a tone, right? So this whole tone scale is just a term that gets used a lot. It really means it's a scale that's made up entirely of whole steps. So just to point of reference, you don't really have to remember this, but I want you to understand the principle, okay? If I start here and I go up a whole step, that's C. A whole step above C is, sing it with me, whole step. One more time, whole step. Now I'm going to go another whole step. Can we sing it without the keyboard? Here's the first note. Let's go, whole step. Yeah, whole step. Now let's sing the first three. One. Let's do 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now go up and down. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. So those are all whole steps. Okay? But now, for an E, what's a whole step above E? F sharp. Now, because this isn't the common scale that you hear all the time, when we sing it, it's going to sound a little odd to you. But notice it's a black key. I got 3 white keys. I go up a whole step. Another whole step would be the next black key, and another whole step would be the next black key. And now, if you'll allow me, you've heard this a jillion times when people were doing angelic and space music. Okay, so that's a whole tone scale, right? Everything's made up in whole steps. Now, what we're going to focus on in this class is the major scale for reasons I mentioned earlier. In Western music, the 7 notes of the major scale, 7 out of our 12 slices, and all the other scales we look at as a variation of that major scale as we go forward. There's a formula for the major scale, and if you look at the bottom of page 10, you got 2 W's and an H, 3 W's and an H. Anybody want to take a wild guess what those stand for? Half, whole half. Let's say it all together now. Now just repeat after me. The formula for the major scale, is whole half, whole half. I like how you matched my tone. That was really beautiful. Sidebar, a lot of people in the world think that they're tone deaf. No such thing. No one's tone deaf. If you were tone deaf, you couldn't tell the difference between someone that's talking to you on the phone from Texas and someone that's talking on the phone from France. If you were tone deaf, you couldn't change the gears on your car because you hear the tone going up and down. Everybody in the world can hear tones. No such thing as tone deaf. Okay? Now with major scale, we go whole half, whole half. Okay? So page 11, let's create a C major scale because now I'll throw this in as a freebie up front, but it's going to get explained later. We start with C because the C major scale doesn't include any black keys, as we're about to find. So you don't have to worry about those nasty sharps and flats right up front. Okay, so heading back over to the keyboard for a second. If you'd like to put your finger on a C or make sure that you're looking at a C, where people get tripped up a lot is they think on the formula that the first thing is this note here, and they think, now notice the formula is whole half. So there's 2 W's at the beginning. And a lot of people, when they're working on this, this will happen to you. So I'm just warning you right now. You'll make the mental mistake that you'll think this becomes almost unknowingly the first one. So then you go whole half. Because when you're looking at it, you go, oh, okay, there's my first note. So I've unconsciously done the first step, and I've gone whole. So I only do 1 whole and then a half step, and that's wrong. And that'll happen. Everybody does it right starting off. So just give yourself some grace. It's whole half, which means you start with a note, and then the first thing is the distance between the first and second note. Did what I just say make sense? A lot of people make this mistake. It's an easy one to make. Okay? So if we're going to build the C major scale, what's a whole step above D? We skip the black, because that's a half, and we go to D, natural. Okay? The next thing is the formula is a whole step. That's an E. So we've gone whole. The next thing is what? Half step to F. Notice we're trending towards all white notes because this is why the guys that made the theory made keyboard players make it easier. Now our next thing is 3 wholes and a half. We've done 2 wholes and a half. Now we're going to do 3 wholes and a half. Distance between F and G is a whole step. Here's a whole step. Here's a whole step. And now a half step to complete it. So the C major scale is all the white notes. Whole, half, whole, 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 half. So far, makes sense?